Operation Rolling Thunder, America's Storm over Vietnam. Chapter 1. The Seeds of the Storm, 1964 to 1965. The jungles of Southeast Asia had already been trembling long before the first American bomb ever fell. Vietnam, a narrow strip of land stretching along the South China Sea, had become the epicenter of the Cold War's most complicated and controversial conflict. After the Geneva Accords of 1954, the once united Vietnam had been split along the 17th parallel, the Communist North, led by Ho Chi Minh, and the anti-Communist South, under Ngo Dinh Diem, and later a succession of unstable governments backed by the United States. By 1964, the Viet Cong, communist guerrillas supported by the North, were growing stronger in the South. The United States was already knee-deep in advising the South Vietnamese military, sending weapons, funds, and thousands of military advisors. But President Lyndon B. Johnson, inheriting the conflict from John F. Kennedy, was reluctant to fully commit U.S. forces. Then came the Gulf of Tonkin incident. On August 2, 1964, the destroyer USS Maddox reported being attacked by North Vietnamese patrol boats. 2 days later, another supposed attack was reported. Though the second event was later revealed to be a misunderstanding, radar ghosts mistaken for real targets, it gave Johnson the justification he needed. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution was passed almost unanimously by Congress, granting the president broad powers to wage war in Vietnam without an official declaration. In early 1965, the Viet Cong stepped up their attacks in South Vietnam, most notably the assault on Pleiku, which killed 8 Americans and wounded more than 100. Washington had had enough. President Johnson approved Operation Rolling Thunder, a sustained bombing campaign against North Vietnam. The goals were ambitious and layered: to cripple the North's industrial and transportation infrastructure, to halt the flow of troops and supplies to the South, to demoralize the North Vietnamese government, and to demonstrate American resolve both to allies and adversaries. On March 2, 1965, the first waves of American aircraft, F-105 Thunder Chiefs, F-8 Crusaders, A-4 Skyhawks, and B-57 Canberras, took off from bases in Thailand and aircraft carriers in the South China Sea. The targets were initially limited: radar stations, barracks, supply depots. But this was the thunder before the storm. The American public was told it was a necessary measure, a response to aggression. The truth, however, was more complicated. Johnson and his advisors hoped the bombing would pressure the North into peace negotiations without having to deploy massive ground forces. But they underestimated both the enemy's resolve and the limitations of air power. As one pilot later recalled, "We were told we were breaking their will to fight, but every time we went back, they had rebuilt what we had destroyed." By the summer of 1965, Rolling Thunder had expanded. American aircraft began striking deeper into North Vietnam: bridges, fuel depots, factories, and railways. Yet strict rules of engagement prevented strikes on certain off-limit targets, including Hanoi, Haiphong Harbor, and areas near the Chinese border, all to avoid provoking the Soviet Union or China. The war was about to escalate beyond anyone's imagination. 1965 to 1967. By late 1965, the roar of jet engines had become a daily sound over North Vietnam. Villagers would look up at the sky and see silver streaks cutting through the clouds, followed by distant explosions that shook the earth. For American pilots, it was the most dangerous battlefield imaginable. The North Vietnamese Air Force, NVF, though small at first, quickly received help from the Soviet Union and China. They were supplied with MiG-17s, MiG-21s, and a network of surface-to-air missile, SAM, batteries that turned the skies into deadly traps. The Americans, confident in their superior technology, found themselves facing a new kind of war, one that could not be won by firepower alone. The F-105 Thunder Chief, known affectionately as the Thud, became the workhorse of Rolling Thunder. It could carry heavy bomb loads, but was vulnerable to both SAMs and anti-aircraft artillery. Nearly half of all F-105s built would be lost in the campaign, a devastating toll. Missions were long, exhausting, and perilous. Pilots flew over rugged mountains and dense jungles, often through thick anti-aircraft fire. They used primitive radar and outdated maps. Many were shot down and captured, becoming prisoners of war in the infamous Hanoi Hilton prison. Every sortie came with the same haunting question: would they make it back? The bombing campaign was massive. By 1967, U.S. aircraft had dropped more than 864,000 tons of bombs on North Vietnam, more than the total dropped in the entire Pacific Theater during World War II. The results, however, were disappointing. North Vietnam's economy suffered, but its will did not break. Its population adapted, moving factories underground, dispersing supplies, and repairing bridges overnight. The Ho Chi Minh Trail, a vast network of jungle paths running through Laos and Cambodia, became the lifeline of the communist war effort. Despite relentless bombing, the flow of men and material to the south continued almost undisturbed. Back in Washington, frustration grew. Johnson and Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara constantly micromanaged the campaign. Every target had to be approved by the White House. Military planners argued for more aggressive bombing, hitting the heart of Hanoi and Haiphong, but political fears of Chinese intervention restrained them. As one Air Force officer bitterly put it, "We were fighting a war with one hand tied behind our back." Meanwhile, on the ground, American troop levels in South Vietnam were rising rapidly. From 23,000 advisors in 1964, the number swelled to over 400,000 by 1967. Rolling Thunder had failed to force the North to back down, and instead, it had drawn the U.S. deeper into a full-scale war. In America, the home front began to shift. Television brought images of burning villages and downed American pilots into living rooms across the country. Protests against the war grew louder. The question began to echo: if we can bomb them endlessly, why are we not winning? Still, the thunder rolled on. Chapter 3: The Fading Thunder, 1967 to 1968. By 1967, the campaign had reached its breaking point. American planes had hit nearly every conceivable target: bridges, power plants, factories, roads, even suspected truck parks. Yet the North Vietnamese government, under Ho Chi Minh and General Vuong Nguyen Giap, refused to surrender. Their message was simple: we will fight for 20 years if necessary. The United States began to question the cost of this strategy. The bombing had caused immense destruction, but it hadn't achieved its political goals. Inside the Pentagon, doubts grew. Secretary McNamara, once the architect of the campaign, became disillusioned. He questioned the morality and effectiveness of the operation, famously admitting later that the bombing did not achieve its purpose. In the skies, the danger escalated. The North's air defenses had become the most sophisticated outside the Soviet Union. MiG pilots used hit-and-run tactics, while SAM sites multiplied like weeds. American losses mounted. Between 1965 and 1968, over 900 U.S. aircraft were shot down. Hundreds of pilots were killed or captured. Among them were men like John McCain, who was shot down in 1967 and spent years as a prisoner of war in Hanoi. Meanwhile, at home, America's faith in the war effort began to crumble. Anti-war movements spread across college campuses. The Tet Offensive in early 1968, a massive surprise attack by the Viet Cong across South Vietnam, shattered the illusion that the U.S. was winning. Public opinion turned sharply against the war. President Johnson, worn down by the relentless conflict and domestic opposition, announced on March 31, 1968, that he would not seek re-election. A few months later, he ordered the halt of Operation Rolling Thunder. After 3 years and 8 months, the thunder had finally faded. The statistics were staggering. 864,000 tons of bombs dropped. Over 900 aircraft lost. Thousands of North Vietnamese civilians and soldiers killed. Billions of dollars spent. Yet the North's will to fight remained unbroken. The campaign had failed to achieve its strategic aims. Still, its impact was undeniable. Rolling Thunder reshaped modern air warfare, leading to new tactics, technologies, and doctrines that would define future U.S. operations. It also left deep scars on American society and politics. For the pilots who flew those missions, the memories never faded. Many spoke of the fear, the brotherhood, the loss, and the haunting question of what it had all been for. One veteran summarized it best: "We had the power to destroy everything, except their determination to fight." Operation Rolling Thunder remains one of the most controversial air campaigns in military history. It demonstrated both the might and the limits of American air power. It showed that technology alone cannot win a war driven by ideology, nationalism, and endurance. When the final mission ended in November 1968, the jungles of Vietnam were quiet for a moment. But beneath that silence lay the rumble of a storm that had only changed form, from bombs in the sky to protests in the streets. The thunder had stopped, but the war and its wounds were far from over. Chapter 4: Legacy and Aftermath, 1969 to 1975. When the last jet roared away from the skies of North Vietnam in late 1968, Operation Rolling Thunder had officially ended, but its echoes lingered far longer than the thunder itself. President Lyndon B. Johnson had stepped back from escalation, leaving behind a divided America and a war that seemed endless. His successor, Richard Nixon, inherited not victory but a quagmire, and with it, the lessons, failures, and consequences of 3 years of continuous bombing. For the American military, the end of Rolling Thunder was not a moment of triumph, but one of reckoning. The lessons written in smoke. Inside the Pentagon, analysts and commanders dissected what had gone wrong. They found no shortage of mistakes. Rolling Thunder had been born of political caution and strategic misunderstanding. The campaign was micromanaged from Washington, each bombing target debated and approved in the White House Situation Room. Johnson had famously remarked that he would not allow a bombing run to start a third world war. Every strike, therefore, was measured, calculated, and constrained. But in trying to avoid escalation with China or the Soviet Union, the U.S. had sacrificed the very element war depends upon: decisiveness. Instead of overwhelming shock and awe, North Vietnam received a predictable, gradual campaign that allowed them to adapt. By the time U.S. pilots were hitting bridges near Hanoi for the 10th time, the North Vietnamese had learned how to hide, disperse, and rebuild faster than America could destroy. Military theorists concluded that air power, without clear political direction, was a blunt instrument. The bombing destroyed infrastructure but never the enemy's will, because that will was rooted not in factories or railroads, but in ideology, nationalism, and the belief that time itself favored them. The human cost. While the campaign was designed to break the enemy's spirit, it often did the opposite. Villages were bombed by mistake. Farmlands turned to craters. Civilians became refugees in their own country. The North Vietnamese used the devastation as propaganda, portraying America as a brutal imperial aggressor. For many in the global community, the images of burned-out towns and wounded children transformed sympathy for the U.S. into outrage. Inside the cockpit, the price was equally heavy. Over 900 American aircraft were lost, and more than 800 pilots were killed, captured, or went missing. Many spent years in Hoa Lo prison, known to POWs as the Hanoi Hilton. These men endured starvation, torture, and isolation. Yet for most, their loyalty to each other never broke. They developed secret codes, tapping messages through the walls, sharing hope through rhythm. We are still here. When some of them finally returned home in 1973, after the Paris Peace Accords, they were met not with parades, but with silence, or worse, protest. The war had changed America, and the soldiers had returned to a nation unsure how to welcome them back. Nixon's New Thunder, Linebacker 1 and 2. Rolling Thunder had ended, but the air war over Vietnam was not finished. By 1972, Nixon sought to pressure Hanoi back to the negotiating table. This time, he unleashed what Rolling Thunder never was allowed to be: an unrestrained, concentrated aerial onslaught. It was called Operation Linebacker I, followed later by Linebacker II, known to history as the Christmas bombings. The difference was stark. Where Johnson had been cautious, Nixon was decisive. B-52 Stratofortresses carpet-bombed Hanoi and Haiphong, with minimal political restriction. In just 2 weeks, Linebacker 2 dropped more tonnage than the entire first year of Rolling Thunder. The results were immediate. North Vietnam returned to negotiations, leading to the Paris Peace Accords of January 1973. To many U.S. strategists, this proved what they had argued all along: that Rolling Thunder failed not because bombing could not work, but because it had been used timidly and inconsistently. But to others, the moral and human toll remained an indelible stain. Even with its success, Linebacker 2 left thousands dead and entire neighborhoods flattened. The question lingered, was this victory or just exhaustion? The political and psychological aftermath. Rolling Thunder also reshaped American politics and society. The campaign had begun as a show of strength. It ended as a symbol of government deception and public disillusionment. Johnson had hidden the war's expansion from Congress and the people. As the truth emerged, that the bombing had done little to shorten the war, faith in leadership eroded. By the early 1970s, the anti-war movement had become a national force. Students, veterans, artists, and ordinary citizens filled the streets. The images of napalm-scorched fields and burning villages became icons of protest. Rolling Thunder's footage, meant to demonstrate American power, instead fueled anger and guilt. Television news brought home nightly images of destruction. For the first time in U.S. history, war was broadcast into living rooms. And what Americans saw did not look like victory. Out of that disillusionment grew a profound mistrust of military intervention, what journalists later called the Vietnam Syndrome. For nearly 2 decades, the U.S. hesitated to commit large forces abroad, haunted by the memories of the jungle and the sound of jet engines over Hanoi. Technological evolution, lessons for future wars. Yet, in military terms, Rolling Thunder became a crucible of innovation. The war exposed flaws in American tactics, communication, and technology, forcing the military to evolve. The U.S. developed precision-guided munitions, improved electronic countermeasures, and pioneered suppression of enemy air defenses (SEAD) missions. The Wild Weasel pilots, who hunted SAM sites, became legends, flying into radar lock to bait missiles before destroying the launchers. These lessons shaped every U.S. air campaign that followed, from the Gulf War in 1991 to Kosovo and Iraq. Commanders learned that air power, when used decisively, coordinated, and technologically precise, could cripple an enemy quickly, the opposite of Rolling Thunder's slow escalation. In a way, the ghosts of 1965 to 1968 still guided the jets of 1991. The North's resilience and the endgame. For North Vietnam, Rolling Thunder was both devastation and motivation. Every bomb that fell reinforced their belief that the United States could destroy, but not conquer. The North's propaganda machine portrayed its citizens as heroic survivors of American aggression. Posters showed peasants repairing bridges under fire, children hauling ammunition, women tending fields beside smoking craters. They called it the American Air War of Destruction, and they used it to strengthen national unity. By 1975, just 7 years after Rolling Thunder ended, Saigon fell. North Vietnamese tanks rolled into the southern capital, uniting the country under communist rule. The war that began with a storm of American thunder ended with the silence of surrender, not from Hanoi, but from Washington. Remembering the thunder, decades later, veterans of Rolling Thunder would gather in quiet reunions. Many were still haunted by the memories, the red tracer rounds rising from the jungle, the alarms of radar lock, the voices of friends lost mid-mission. For the Vietnamese people, the scars remained in the land itself. Decades later, craters still dotted the countryside, and unexploded ordnance lay hidden beneath the soil. In those scars lay reminders of a storm that lasted more than 3 years, and yet never achieved its aim. The final echo. When historians look back at Operation Rolling Thunder, they see more than an air campaign. They see a story about beliefs colliding in the sky, the American faith in technology and control against the Vietnamese faith in patience and endurance. It was a war fought from the clouds, but shaped by human choices. Each decision, each hesitation, each bomb drop rippling across history. The thunder faded long ago, but its echoes remain, in military academies, in memoirs, in the minds of those who lived through it. Every modern general who plans an air campaign still hears that echo. Power without purpose is noise. And even the loudest thunder cannot end a storm it doesn't understand. The silence after the storm. By the mid-1970s, America's focus had turned inward, to healing, rebuilding trust, and confronting the painful truth of Vietnam. Operation Rolling Thunder became both a warning and a lesson. That war, once unleashed, is easier to start than to control. For the Vietnamese who survived it, it was a time of loss and endurance. For the Americans who fought it, it was a time of courage shadowed by futility. And for the world that watched, it was proof that in modern warfare, thunder alone does not bring victory, only noise before the rain.